Uncle Andy's by James Warhola. A fabulous visit with Andy Warhol. Paul Warhola was the eldest of three brothers who grew up in the smoky industrial city of Pittsburgh. He and his wife, Anne, moved to the country to raise their 7 children. He loved his junk business, which allowed him to be his own boss and choose his own hours. Life in the countryside was far from easy, but for us kids, we had a wonderful, carefree existence. Paul's youngest brother, Andy, left Pittsburgh for New York City in 1949 and soon dropped the A from his name to become known as Andy Warhol. He became very successful as a commercial illustrator. During the early 1960s, Andy entered the realm of fine art. He was part of a small group of artists who believed that they could stretch the limits of art even more by portraying ordinary things that were popular to modern society. It quickly became known as pop art. Every few months, we made a pilgrimage to New York City to visit our Uncle Andy and our grandmother, whom we affectionately referred to as Bubba. As the trips progressed through the 50s, there became more of us, and our car acquired a caravan quality. As kids, we looked forward to each trip as a great adventure to a very exotic land, a land apart from ours, where people dyed their hair purple and walked herds of dogs through the streets. Our oasis was Uncle Andy's and Bubba's house. The following story is about a trip that we took in August 1962. It was a very important year for Andy Warhol. He had his first solo exhibition, in which he introduced the world to his soup can paintings. Though he has achieved great prominence in the art world, we will always remember him as our Uncle Andy. Looking back on those days, the one thing I remember most is thinking my dad had the best darn job in the world. Our yard was always so much more fun than anyone else's in the neighborhood. My oldest brother was already away at college, but there were still 6 of us at home. Dad had lots of jobs, but for now, he was mostly a junk man. Sometimes the neighbors complained that our yard looked like a junkyard. However, the real junkyard was about a mile away on a dirt road. It was up a really steep hill. It had everything: old cars, old pop machines, and old airplane engines. You name it. It was there on the hill. Dad's job was to take things apart and separate the metals: aluminum, copper, brass, and steel. When there was enough, he loaded the truck and hauled it into another junkyard. Dad was always bringing home junk, and sometimes he'd say to me, "Now, Jamie, this can make really good art." Then he'd put a bunch of it together in an interesting way. Mom was always yelling to Dad, "For Pete's sake, Paul, quit junking up the house." And Paul, "When are you going to get rid of this stuff, anyhow?" But we liked playing in the junk. One day, Dad came home from work and announced, "It's time to visit Bubba and Uncle Andy in the big city. We'll leave tomorrow morning." Oh, we were so excited. It was not often we got to visit our grandma and our famous artist uncle in New York City. We had a lot of getting ready to do. Dad had work to do on the car. Mary Lou and Eva had to make sandwiches. Georgie and I had to pack the car, and little Maddie and Marty, well, they didn't do too much. They were just in the way. The next morning, Mom woke us up extra early, and we were finally on our way. We saw nothing but cornfields and cow pastures at first. Then, we slowly counted the 7 tunnels that it would take us to get there. When we came to the last tunnel, we were all perked up. All of a sudden, the world became very different. There were giant buildings, honking taxis, and people going every which way. Dad slowly wove his way uptown to Uncle Andy's. There we were, all 8 of us, standing in front of a huge black door, ringing the bell. After a long wait, the door unlatched and slowly opened. Uncle Andy peered out for a minute and then let out a long "Oh!" Dad always thought it was the best not to phone ahead so that it would be a surprise. It certainly worked. Uncle Andy was always very, very surprised. He showed us in, and we made our way to the kitchen, where our grandmother was. Bubba drowned us with wet kisses, as she always did, and fixed us a dinner of salamis, breads, and cheeses. Soon, all the chattering and eating came to an end, and it was time for sleep. Uncle Andy showed us to our makeshift beds. I slept on the top floor and propped up an old door covered with cushions. In the morning, I noticed that I was surrounded by towers of soup boxes. I thought Uncle Andy and Bubba sure ate a lot of soup, but that wasn't it at all. Uncle Andy didn't buy these soup boxes. He built them out of wood and painted each one. They were art, and really important too, because Uncle Andy told us not to touch any of it. Dad always remembered to bring Uncle Andy something interesting from the junkyard. This time, it was a giant magnet with a bunch of bolts stuck to it. Uncle Andy peered over his glasses at it real carefully. And after a pause, he said, "Oh, gee, wow." Then we really knew he liked it. He decided that it should go right by the front door. Uncle Andy had 25 cats, all named Sam. They were always hiding in a house that was just like a giant museum. It was perfect for hide and go seek and racing. It wasn't long before the 6 of us were flying up and down the stairs through all the rooms like a band of wild monkeys. Uncle Andy thought everything was art in some way or another. That's why his house was so fantastic. Each of the rooms was filled to the brim with all sorts of neat things. There were always new things to see. Right in the middle of the entranceway, there was a giant piece of crumpled metal. It looked like it might have gotten stuck there and couldn't go any further. Uncle Andy explained to us, "Oh, that's a piece of fabulous art by a famous artist." We were impressed. Dad sure had a lot of that back at home. Uncle Andy was always making art. We loved watching him paint in his studio. He made regular stuff, like soup cans, pop bottles, and money looked like real art. Mary Lou and Eva just loved his giant pictures of Elvis Presley. Mom, always aware of unnecessary color, asked, "Gee, Andy, when are you going to get rid of some of this stuff?" Uncle Andy, startled, said, "Oh no, this is art. It's going to be worth a lot of money." Mom didn't really understand Andy's art, I guess. With all the commotion that we caused, Uncle Andy decided it might be better to put us all to work. It wasn't long before each of us had a different job. He knew I liked to do art, so he let me help him with his giant paint-by-number sailboat painting. At night, Uncle Andy went out to parties to see other famous people. In the morning, we patiently sat by his door, waiting for it to open so he could tell us all about who he had met. Once, Maddie surprised Uncle Andy by going into his room a little too early. He let out a shriek because he didn't have his wig on yet. Of course, we all knew Uncle Andy was bald, just like Dad and Uncle John. Uncle Andy had wigs for every occasion. Messy makeup wigs, multicolored afternoon wigs, and formal wigs for parties. He had given Dad his old wigs, and back at home, we had a lot of fun with them. Each day was a chance to see something new. We especially loved hiding in the studio when Uncle Andy had important art people over to talk about his artwork. They would all huddle around the paintings, pointing and peering. They really thought Uncle Andy was onto something. I knew his paintings were super neat, and it made me want to do my own art when I got home. Finally, Dad announced, "It's time to get on home." That night, we packed up all of our things. Again, Mary Lou and Eva made the sandwiches. Bubba added a few salamis. Uncle Andy was on his way out the door with one of his soup can paintings when I told him we had to leave in the morning. He replied, Oh, really? I have to go out and sell this picture to a man waiting at the corner. You know, he's the taxi cab king. He really likes my work. Then I'm going to a party. Oh, so have a fabulous trip. Jamie, bye." We went to bed early, and before I knew it, Mom was wiggling my toes and saying, "Time to get up." Bubba helped us with our things as we trudged out to the dark morning. At the foot of the steps, there was a bunch of boxes that Uncle Andy had left for all of us. A lot of neat stuff, including art supplies for me. Bubba drowned us with those wet kisses as we got into the car. Soon we were weaving our way downtown to go through the first tunnel. We all fell asleep, wondering about our next trip back to Uncle Andy's. As we got older, we made many more trips back to that faraway city. And Dad continued bringing interesting junk from the junkyard for Uncle Andy. I really liked doing art, and I learned that art is something that is all around us all the time. In the corner of my bedroom, I made an art studio of my own, and although Mom fretted and fussed, as usual, over what a mess it all was, she didn't make me clean it up. She even woke me up early on Saturdays to drive me to art class. You know, I think Mom's finally understanding what art is all about. James Warhola has illustrated a number of popular children's books, including Bigfoot Cinderella and The Bear Came Over to My House. Uncle Andy's is the first book he has written and illustrated. You can visit James at www.jameswarhola.com. There they are right here, Andy, Mary Lou, and James in 1963. When James Warhola was a little boy, his father, the local junk man, always had the urge to make something interesting out of junk. And when they drove to New York City to visit Uncle Andy, James and his family were truly amazed by how the most ordinary of everyday things can inspire a work of art. Offering a unique perspective on Andy Warhol, James recounts the wackiness of visiting Uncle Andy, complete with waking up to towers of soup boxes and playing hide-and-go-seek with 25 cats, all named Sam. But even more important, James shares how he learned about beauty and art from an innovative master. Hi, so for today's Andy Warhol inspired project, I'm going to try to make a recreation of a common object. Just like Andy made a recreation of soup cans onto wooden boxes, I'm going to try to turn this piece of scrap wood into a chapstick. So that's what I'm going to do today. If you don't have a piece of scrap wood, you could use a piece of cardboard. So if you find a recycled box, you could cut a strip of cardboard to act as your piece of wood today. And then you're going to need a common object. So either you could pick out a soup can or something else from your house, like maybe a pencil, or you could use a shampoo bottle or a chapstick, or another food object in your house, something that's a common object that you're going to try to recreate. I picked something kind of simple, so if this might be kind of difficult, I would pick something simple too. But feel free to get as complicated as you want with this project. So for my project, I'm going to use colored pencils. You could use markers or paint if you have. I might use some markers depending on how well I can draw on this. But depending on what surface you're working on, you might want to pick either markers, colored pencils, or something else. So if you're using paper or cardboard, you probably could get away with crayons or colored pencils or markers. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start with this color here, this green color, and I noticed that this part has black on it, so I'm going to kind of turn my chapstick and figure out what side I want to draw. I think I'm going to maybe turn it like this so I can see part of the word chapstick, but not the whole thing. So I'm going to start with the drawing, and I got the top part and the bottom part, and then I'm going to put that part of the chapstick in there. I might not be able to write the word chapstick, but maybe I can. So I think for this one, I'm just going to make a white strip to represent the words, because writing them would be really hard. And then all I have to do is start coloring.